To say Age of Sigmar was a brave but foolish move is an understatement. It was almost a failure. It divided the community and confused newcomers, leading to Games Workshop having a lot of headaches over the years. And yet, seemingly against all the odds, this outcast of the Warhammer family has bloomed into something incredible. And even though it had this rough start, today it stands as one of the most exciting and innovative tabletop games out there, and I want to talk about it. This video shall be covering all the basics of this side of Warhammer, from what Age of Sigmar is, to how the lore almost ended up destroying the game itself, and a basic guide on what the game is like. So by the end of this video, you'll have a good understanding about what Age of Sigmar is. Age of Sigmar is a property owned by Games Workshop, and it comes in a multitude of different formats. There are video games, stories, but perhaps the most recognisable format is that of the tabletop game. The tabletop game centres around a multitude of different factions of which you collect, paint and play with, and the games you play depend as to the parameters you set. But you should know that all the games are going to be centred around some form of warfare, and ultimately the way that you face your opponent is ultimately up to you. You choose your faction regardless of how good or evil they can be, and then you get to choose the units that you want to yield on the battlefield. Much like the rest of Warhammer, Age of Sigmar is extremely modular when it comes to army building. However, as mentioned briefly, the tabletop isn't the only section of Age of Sigmar. You might be someone that's more into artistic expression, in which case you can choose whoever you like the look of and paint them as such. Or you may be someone that's more interested in learning about lore, in which case there are a multitude of different books and stories in which you can read. Now with that being said, even though Age of Sigmar is roughly 8 years old, the lore goes back around 30 years. You see, Age of Sigmar is a sequel. Before Age of Sigmar came Warhammer, the Old World, or as it's more commonly known as, Warhammer Fantasy. And Warhammer Fantasy is completely separate from Age of Sigmar. This is where many people get confused and blur the lines between Warhammer Fantasy and Age of Sigmar, and I should know, I was one of them. Now for those of you who may be or are interested in the lore of Age of Sigmar, this next section is going to be for you, as I'll be briefly going over the lore, and we'll be starting off with how Warhammer Fantasy ended. The world of Warhammer Fantasy had its fair share of conflicts, but it was ultimately unprepared for its final one. Known as the End Times, the forces of chaos united under one banner and fought all those who opposed them. All other races mustered their forces in order to prevent this encroaching darkness, but ultimately, one by one, they began to fall. Great heroes and villains fell on the battlefield until there was no one left. But not everything was destroyed, for the God King of mankind, Sigmar, survived. He hurtled through space, clinging to his destroyed world for months, years, maybe even millennia. But his state of solitary wouldn't last forever, for the dragon Dracothian found him. Dracothian introduced Sigmar to the mortal realms, 8 expansive planes of existence floating in the ether. Sigmar traversed through the realms and began to find out that there were more beings from the old world that survived. Reviving them also allowed the primitive forms of mortal races to come back, though this wasn't always perfect. Whilst the mortal races started to prosper, another threat emerged in that chaos returned. This led to a war of gods in which Sigmar was partially defeated and had to retreat. Knowing that he could no longer risk taking part in a battle, Sigmar decided to create an army, and as the forces of chaos marched across the mortal realms, Sigmar unleashed them. With the flash of lightning and the crack of thunder, the Stormcast Eternals emerged, ushering in the Age of Sigmar. And with the Stormcast Eternals, Sigmar aimed to cleanse the realms of chaos. Civilization slowly started to return to the realms, although chaos was never fully removed. Alongside this, Nagash sought to conquer the realms and enslave all into his undead armies, whilst at the same time greenskin hordes rampaged. Eventually these groups formed themselves into the 4 grand alliances of order, chaos, death and destruction. Nagash sought to invoke death magic across the realms, and if it wasn't for the Skaven, he would have succeeded. But this inadvertently caused issues with the magic of the realms, as now instead of spells lasting a few moments, they could last forever. This seemingly never-ending magic was fittingly named the Endless Spells, and the races used them frequently to destroy their enemies. Currently, the lore takes place in the realm of Gur. It's a savage land of beasts and monsters that is sought to be tamed by the Dawnbringer Crusades of the Stormcast Eternals. And with this, we have caught up with the lore. Now there's obviously going to be a lot more than what I have described, however this is the basic gist of what the story is like. But this is just the main story. There are a ton of books on various different characters, factions and sub-stories, all of which which providing their various and unique approaches to the mortal realms. But it hasn't always been perfect. In fact, it started off extremely messy, mainly because Games Workshop destroyed a huge portion of their fan base. As I've said previously, before Age of Sigmar came Warhammer Fantasy, and to say its ending was ill-received is putting it lightly. In fact, this change from Warhammer Fantasy to Age of Sigmar could have potentially destroyed Warhammer as a whole, and is one of the reasons why Age of Sigmar has been so controversial. Warhammer Fantasy had not been selling well several years before the start of Age of Sigmar. Whilst it was beloved by many, it wasn't enough to keep up the profit margins. Fantasy was by no means bad, it just wasn't getting enough attention as 40k. And whilst this is a rumour, so I can't exactly prove it, it has been said that even the Space Marine line alone was able to outsell Fantasy. And so, Games Workshop, desperate to try and up their sales, decided to rebrand Fantasy entirely. But in their desperation to get this new line out, it didn't exactly go very well. It started off with a line of books known as the End Times, which were preparing people to move on to Age of Sigmar. But these books were about as well received as the ending of Game of Thrones. In the books, chaos destroyed everything, and I do mean everything. The characters and factions that you grew to love died in a near instant. And one of these factions I've actually talked about on my channel, the Tomb Kings, who were killed off much like the rest of Warhammer Fantasy. There wasn't really even a heroic send-off for anyone, it just ended. Now imagine the frustration and sadness that you would be feeling, only to hear that Games Workshop is releasing Fantasy 2.0. It's going to be bigger, it's going to be better, and it's going to have everything you love about fantasy. At least that's probably what Games Workshop thought. Instead, the story was all over the place, and the factions that you may have loved, such as the Tomb Kings, are no longer in this world. The anger and frustration that came from this is still being felt to this day. Whilst it has certainly died down, that hatred is still there in people's hearts. And honestly, I can't really blame them. To have the models that you have been painting and the stories that you have been reading for years go away overnight must be heartbreaking. And whilst Games Workshop is reintroducing certain aspects of fantasy through Warhammer the Old World, it still isn't going to be the same. But whilst it certainly had this rough start, it has grown into something more. Games Workshop has heavily expanded across the lore, trying to flesh out these realms. And whilst it certainly does have that stain of when it first started, it has been generally well received. The books have spanned across these various different factions and realms, providing people with great reads suited to their needs. Now, whilst many people do enjoy the lore, it's not the main lure of Age of Sigmar. That instead goes to the tabletop game. The game of Age of Sigmar has a wide variety of different areas of which you need to learn. Now, these areas that you're going to learn aren't going to hurt your head, but it is going to keep you on your toes. One of these areas is learning about editions. Editions are essentially Games Workshop's way of progressing the mainline story of the lore alongside providing players with new rules. When a new edition is released, it's typically a big celebratory moment, in which a massive box set is released containing all new models and rules. Currently we're on 3rd edition, and for its release it was the Dominion box set. Editions are also roughly released every 3 years, which means at the time of this recording there should be a new box set coming out within the next couple of years. Another point of note is that it isn't just the core rules that you need to have, you also need to have something known as a battle tome. Battle tomes are essentially your own little guide to your army. They provide you with all the information that you could possibly need about them, such as how far they can move, how strong they are, and how many points they cost. They also give you information about the lore of your army, but you don't have to read that. But one thing that should be noted is that if you only want to read the rules of your army, you don't have to buy a battle tome, you can use something such as Warhampedia instead. This website provides you with literally every single thing you need to know about your army, alongside it being frequently updated. Now let's say you've chosen your faction and have an idea as to what it is you want to field on the battlefield, whether it's ranged, melee or magic based, or even mixed, it doesn't matter. Just know that you can't take absolutely everything you can possibly get your hands on. This is because games are played based on the number of points that are in your army. Typically games are around 2,000 points, though this can be adjusted to both you and your opponent's desired army size. And points are based upon the models in your army. Different models have different points depending as to how strong or big they are. So, for example, these Namati Reavers cost 160 points for 10 models, whereas this larger, more powerful Achillean Leviathan cost 400 points. What this means is you can have as many models as you want, and whatever type of model you want, so long as it isn't above 2,000 points. Now that you should have your army, let's talk about the battlefield. Battlefields are on a 44 by 60 inch board board, and what's on the battlefield is up to you. Do you want a vast grassland with a few rocks covering both sides, or would you prefer a close quarters city to get face to face with your opponent? Everything about it is modular, with you choosing what the cover shall be, which means that no two battles shall ever be the same. The other thing as well is that because this is a game of imagination, you can use literally anything that you want on the board. You could say that a shoebox is a cathedral or a spray can a bell tower. So long as you and your opponent are okay with it, it doesn't really matter what you put on the tabletop. With the battlefield setup, the way the game works is through rounds and phases. There are a total of 5 rounds, or 5 turns for you and your opponent, making 10 turns. Whoever either outright defeats their opponent or has the most points at the end of the 10 turns wins. Now, as for the phases, these are the things that you do within your turns. There are a total of 6 phases, though depending as to what your army may be, there may be less. These phases are the hero phase, movement phase, shooting phase, charge phase, combat phase, and battle shock phase. In the hero phase, you get to cast spells and heroic abilities. The way that you do these actions, much like many of the things in this game, is by using dice, and the spells and abilities that you have for your units can be seen on your battle tome. Before the movement phase, this requires a tape measure and seeing how far your unit can move, although it should be said that movement can be affected by dice rolls such as running. The shooting phase sees you firing your ranged weapons towards your enemies, but if you're fielding an army that doesn't have any ranged units, then you have to move on to the next phase automatically. The charge phase occurs when any of your units are within 12 inches of the enemy. The way you find out if a charge is successful or not is through rolling 2d6 dice. The number you roll is the amount of inches your unit moves. If an opponent is 9 inches away and the dice added together equal a 9 or higher, you can charge, but anything else means it's a fail. The combat phase occurs when units are within 3 inches of their opponent, and melee combat can commence. How a unit wins melee combat is dependent on a few things, these being the rolls to hit, wound, save, and damage. If a player is rolling a dice and succeeds in a hit roll, then they move on to the wound roll. Then depending as to how many wound rolls are successful, the opposing player rolls to save. And then finally, depending as to how many save rolls are successful, damage rolls can commence. This will then see if a model or unit has died on the battlefield. And finally, the battle shock phase sees how many models or units run away from the battlefield due to their morale being low. And with that, that should be the entire game of Age of Sigmar. Now there are obviously a few things that I've left out, however this is the general gist of the game. But if you do feel that I've missed something that is important, please do feel free to comment down below. When it comes to talking about the game, the saying easy to learn, hard to master comes to mind. In the past 3 or 4 minutes I have pretty much described the entire game to you, but obviously different factions have their different abilities and different models their different stats. This really means that you can create armies that work off each other's units, and the best way to find that out is to play the game yourself, of which I'll be leaving this part in your own hands. But if you are planning on playing the game, please do remember the most important rule. This rule is easy enough to understand, but you may find yourself struggling at points. This rule is simply have fun. You won't win every game, you won't be the perfect painter, and you most certainly won't know every single piece of the lore. Just remember, you can always improve your craft, and as long as you're having fun doing it, then nothing else really matters. Age of Sigmar could have failed. It could have been the forgotten part of Warhammer that only a few enjoyed at a certain time, or it could have been remembered as something only to be hated, but it hasn't. And I'm glad of this. Whilst I am sad that Warhammer Fantasy is no longer with us and it will never truly return, I still enjoy Age of Sigmar. And whilst I understand this game may seem complicated at first with its many various sections that need to be understood, I hope that this video has shed light onto this game and helped guide you on your path wherever you may end up going. And no matter what it is that you end up doing, I hope that you have a great time whilst doing so. I thank you ever so much for watching, hope you have a good day, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.